Good afternoon. I'm Rory Fitzgerald, Director of the European Social Survey. Welcome to our special lunchtime event today on the ESS Timing of Life module. This module, which looks at the timing of key life events, was first fielded in 2006 and 2007 and is then being repeated in our 9th round in 2018-2019. We're going to have a series of short talks today, short in the sense of 6 to 8 minutes per speaker, and then at the end there'll be some time for questions and answers. So please do type your questions into the Q&A and we'll attempt to answer those at the end of today's seminar. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Francesco Bellari from Bocconi University, who was the head of the question module design team. Francesco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rory. Let me share my screen. It's a great pleasure to be here. So my name is Francesco Bellari, or Bellari, you choose, and I work at Bocconi University in Milan, Italy. And on behalf of the design team for the Timing of Life module, I would like to shortly introduce the module, its general meaning, its significance. But before doing so, I'd like to mention the composition of our group, the design team, which includes some of the speakers today: Gunhild Hagestad from Norway, Arlief Brewer from the Netherlands, George Peder from Hungary, Jan van Badel from Belgium, but also Rick Settersten from the United States, but also a co-author of the top-line report we are presenting today. So what do we mean about, what do we mean by timing of life? Think about your life, the life of your friends, of your closest relatives. How would you actually describe their lives? Normally, we think about the key events that have happened to an individual and locate these events in their life. And how do we locate them? The passage of time for us means that we think about age. The notion of age, also the world around us is changing. This is the key issue around the timing of life. For example, when were we born? At what age did we become independent? At what age did we leave education? At what age did we form a family? At what age did we retire? So we think about individual biographies or the autobiography if we are asking to an individual to report about their life. And this is we cover in the European Social Survey. The question whether this is important, of course we believe this is important. It's easy to see for each of us how important are these events and how important are the times at which these events happen. The events give central meaning to our life and have fundamental implication to our life. However, at the level of societies, at the macro level, countries and regions, all these individual biographies taken together with their interactions, for instance, some of these events imply joint decisions like forming or dissolving a partnership. All these biographies taken together shape societal change, population change, economic change. So how to study this? What are the key challenges in studying the timing of life in European societies? So in the module, we ask basically what is at what age is this central event, in what order did this event happen, and what is the relationship between what happens to our life and the context in which we live, including the society, the economy, but also friends and relatives. So as it was already anticipated by the ESS director, the first time we had the opportunity to fill the module Timing of Life in the European Social Survey was in round 3 between 2006 and 2007. And the majority of this module was repeated in round 9, 2018-19. And we are very much looking forward to seeing this module used, and you will see use of it today. There are basically 2 key areas in the module. First, we ask about the autobiography of the respondent. So when did they start a job, leave the parental home, started living with a spouse or partner, marry, have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. This is the part we are not going to cover extensively today. We are going to cover mostly the second part. We asked to respondents their subjective views on the timing of life. Since these views differ according to whether we are talking about women or about men, we use a so-called split ballot design. So randomly, half of the survey respondents get questions on the subjective views on the timing of life for girls and women, and the other half gets asked about boys and men. Then basically we ask explicitly about ideas about the ages at which individuals become adults, middle-aged, and old. We ask about the ideal age to do certain things. In particular, these key events, when they are too young, when they are too old to do certain things. Finally, we ask about the approval or disapproval of specific choices in the timing of life. So we are very grateful to the European Social Survey to have the opportunity to have worked with this fantastic data. The top line publication we are introducing today and the presentations that will follow will focus on the subjective views of Europeans on the timing of life, comparing societies and change over time. And we are looking forward to your interest in the timing of life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco, for that very nice introduction. And without further ado, we're going to move to Gunhild, who's going to talk about stages of adulthood for men and women.
I think some of us that were involved in the planning of this were inspired by anthropologists who really were path breakers in studying transitions and phases of life early in the 20th century. And we, like Margaret Mead and Van Gennep and Linton, who was both an anthropologist and a sociologist, was our main message carrier that age and gender need to be considered together. There is a her and a his life. And I think we all agree that there's no such thing as a generic child and a generic older person. There are boys and girls and men and women. So here, Rick and I have worked on how, if we look at the timing of adulthood and middle age and old age, how do members of different societies perceive entry into these life phases for men and women? Do they see different boundaries for men and women? And do men and women have a different picture of this? So the first is adulthood. Cultural ideas about when people become adult are significantly later than legal age, which is typically 18. And average, I think some of us were really surprised by this, that average ages of perceived adulthood spans 8 years, from a low of 18 for when men talk about British and Czech women, to almost 26 when women talk about Bulgarian and Montenegrin men. But there's a profound and very clear trend that men everywhere are seen as becoming adults later than women. To some women, that's not a big surprise. But between the two times of measurement, the perceived thresholds increased in all countries, but more for women than men, and men were more stable across the two observation points. But at both times, more than 2/3 of male respondents said that women enter adulthood before age 20. In sharp contrast, there is not a single country where women say that men become adults before age 20. So I think that this is a very good example of how, even though we have legal definitions of adulthood, perceptions are gendered, suggesting differences in psychological maturity, relationships, and economic independence. Now, as we'll see in a bit, old age also has some legal definitions, but middle age really lack them. It doesn't have any legal definitions. So I must admit that I expected greater variability and less consensus, even within a society on that one. But that didn't turn out to be really the case. In terms of range of average age, we go from a low under 36 for women in Spain to a high of 53 for Italian men, which is a difference of 17 years. And the variability across countries so there doesn't really see within countries to be a double standard for men's and women's middle age. Even in Spain and Italy, which show the lowest and the highest values, the ages assigned to women and men are quite similar. So in Spain, it's about 35 for both, and no, in Italy and in Spain, it's 52, 53. The striking range of ages across countries suggests that there are cultural differences in the meaning and significance of middle age. And I remember when we met in the planning of this, we heard about France, which translates it into prime of life, which is quite different from middle age in some other languages. And the French say it's at 35. So across countries, people reach middle age at quite different times, but within countries, there is really, to me, surprising little difference between perceptions of men and women. Now, when we get to old age, it's a different story. When do people become old? We see a range from 61 and 60 for men and women in Croatia to 70 and 69 in Italy. So you have a cross-national difference of about 10 years. But in the first round especially, women were always seen as becoming old before men. And a clear finding is that these views are driven more by men than by women. And by the time we get to the 18 data collection, women have started seeing the light and saying that no, women become old later than men. But men keep insisting basically that no, they become old later than women, even though life expectancy differences are still consistent, ranging from at least 4-year greater life expectancy for women than for men. And we still have 3 countries in the Baltic area where the difference is 9 years in life expectancy, but you don't see that reflected in when old age starts, which I think is a provocative finding. There is indeed some kind of double standard, and the stark gender differences are somewhat paradoxical. Life expectancy favors women. We might expect that it should go in the opposite direction, but there's also the fact that women suffer more from chronic health conditions and manage them longer. As the Brits say, women are sicker, men die quicker. And it's possible that the bodies of women leave them more vulnerable to loss of social status and this double standard of aging. But I find that a very interesting thing to explore. I also hope we can find some time today to talk about age and gender in the time of the pandemic and what kinds of questions we would want to ask, because it's beginning to appear that the most vulnerable group are most likely young adult men in terms of long-term life course effects. And that reminds me of some of the findings that Glenn Elder reported in Effects of the Great Depression. And as you may know, Rick has worked with Glenn on a book that just came out. So I hope we can keep going and use our findings so far to ask new questions that will have relevance for the unique historical situation that we're in now. Thanks.
Thank you, Gunhild. And now we're going to move on to Art Lieferaar from Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute and University of Groningen. He's going to talk about new living arrangements in the transition to adulthood. Art, over to you.
Thank you, Rory. Like Gunhild Hagestad told us, the age at which young people are considered to be adults has been increasing during the last decade. At what age you are considered to be an adult is, of course, related to the timing of major events on the road to independence, like leaving the parental home, entering the labor market, and starting to live with a partner. You might expect that people's views on how this road to independence should look like changes in response to major upheavals, like the Great Recession or the COVID crisis. And indeed, we do observe changes in the views on the living arrangements of young adults. In this short presentation, I would like to highlight two of these trends. The first trend is that the acceptance of young adults staying in the parental home for an extended period of time during young adulthood seems to be increasing. We asked respondents at what age they felt men and women to be too old to still live in the parental home. Three things stand out, as this figure makes clear. First, there's a huge variation across European regions. Staying in the parental home until your late 20s or early 30s is much more approved of in Southern and Eastern Europe than in Western and Northern Europe. In Italy, in 2018, the average age at which men are deemed to be too old to live in the parental home is 34, whereas it's only 25 in Denmark. Second, the blue points are views for men and the red ones for women. And almost all blue points are above the red ones, indicating that generally there is more approval for men living in the parental home for an extended period of time than for women doing so. And third, there seems to be a slight tendency towards approving the postponement of leaving the parental home, as the dots representing the views in 2018 are generally above the triangles representing the views in 2006. This could signify a response among European citizens to the increasing difficulties that young adults face on the labor market, but also on the housing market. Finally, there are some notable but hard to explain exceptions to the general trend. In Cyprus and Portugal, upper age limits in 2018 are lower than in 2006, 2007. Another major change in how Europeans view living arrangements of young adults is the increasing approval of unmarried cohabitation as part of the demographic life course. We asked respondents whether they approved or disapproved with a woman or a man living with a partner without being married to him or her. This figure shows trends in 4 countries, each representing a geographical region of Europe. Sweden clearly is a frontrunner. Hardly anyone disapproves of unmarried cohabitation, as you can see from the length or the non-length of the blue bar. The percentages disapproving of unmarried cohabitation are also very low in Spain and in France. In Poland, they are somewhat higher, but still only a minority disapproves of unmarried cohabitation. And over time, disapproval of unmarried cohabitation decreases. Again, this is clearest in Poland, where the percentage disapproving of unmarried cohabitation decreased from 34% in 2006 to 20% in 2018. These changes might reflect changing economic circumstances that make it harder for young adults to commit to marriage, but they certainly also reflect cultural change that reduces the importance of marriage as a marker of becoming an adult. both the increasing approval of living in the parental home for extended periods of time and the fact that unmarried cohabitation is now viewed by almost all as a normal part of the young adult life course suggest changes in how Europeans view the transition to adulthood. It feels like it's not just postponement of traditional family roles like marriage, but rather like writing a new script of young adulthood, in which marriage has lost its centrality and living longer with parents and unmarried cohabitation becoming the new normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. And now we'll move on to Jan van Bavel from University of Leuven, who's going to talk about the issue of having children in Europe. Jan, over to you.
Hi everyone, I share my screen. Okay, good afternoon. So I don't think I have to convince you that the dynamics of having children in Europe is indeed of central importance for the future of Europe and its population dynamics. If you only think about the populations of schools, universities, the workforce, the electorate, if you're interested in politics, healthcare, pensioners, and so on and so forth. And you also know that comparatively speaking, European fertility levels have been very low in recent decades, and they're actually very low right now. According to the most recent estimate by the Eurostat, currently for the European Union as a whole, they're at 1.5 around 2019. Generally, in the 21st century, there has been some years where total fertility rates were going up, but after the 2008 financial economic crisis, they've been going down. And talking about the timing of having children, well, in these fluctuations that we see in European fertility rates, it's of crucial importance, the timing of having children. Much that the timing of having children have affected the ups and downs in the total fertility rates much more than the quantum of the family sizes per se. And as you probably know, the major trends in recent decades in Europe has been the postponement of the transition to parenthood. So men and women were having their first child at an ever later age than generations before them. That's a trend that has been going on since the 1970s. And obviously, there's also some kind of spillover effect from timing to quantum. So some people who have their first child at a later age and eventually have a smaller family at the end, or some even don't have any children at all because they were postponing. Now, these ideas and ideals about what is the best age and what is perhaps the latest age to make this transition, these ideas and ideals are clearly culturally variable. Demographers are familiar with the fact that since several centuries already, there's been an early transition to marriage and parenthood, relatively speaking, within Europe. In the more eastern parts of Europe and in the northwestern parts of Europe, for example, this transition is typically at a later age. Now, in earlier work, based among other on the first round of the timing of life module, we have showed that these ideals and the age deadlines are part of the mechanisms driving actual fertility. So now, thanks to the repeat of this module, we have a second measurement, so we can observe actual change. And I think that there's a number of very interesting findings coming out from this new data. Among others, the age deadlines, so the age at which people say it's becoming too late to make a transition to parenthood, they have been shifting upwards. So there's further postponements or further upward shift of this age deadline. But the thing I want to highlight, the observation I want to highlight in this presentation is I think the most remarkable change is that we find even further shift upwards of the ideal ages for making a transition to parenthood according to the respondents of the European Social Survey. Now in this graph, you see women depicted in red, and men depicted in blue. And of course, no surprise that across the board, the blue dots and triangles are above the red ones, meaning that the ideal age for parenthood for women is a bit lower than for men. Typically, the gap is around 2 years. In 2018, 2019, the average ideal ages for motherhood ranged from about 25 to 28 years. And so for men, it was on average between 27 and 30 years of age. And in line with earlier findings, the lowest ideal ages are found in more to the east of Europe, typically, for example, in the Baltic states. If you look to the right-hand side of this graph, you see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are among the countries with the lowest ideal ages for parenthood, along with, for example, Slovakia and Bulgaria. And also historically, these are among the countries that have exhibited relatively early transitions to motherhood. Whereas on the left-hand side of the graph, you see countries with relatively high ideal ages for motherhood. For example, in Southern European countries, Cyprus, Italy, Spain, as well as in Switzerland, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Now, looking at change over time, that's, I think, the most important finding that we observe here. So here you compare the dots with the triangles, you see a very consistent upward shift in the ideal ages. So the ideal ages have shifted along with the actual ages at making the transition to parenthood. And so now you could think that perhaps there's been a convergence going on between the ideal ages for parenthood and the actual ages for parenthood. Now, we can, for motherhood, the transition to motherhood, we can observe, based on Eurostat data, we can observe the actual ages at making a transition to motherhood. And that's what is depicted in this graph. So you see the ideal age as observed in the first timing of life module, 2006, and then as observed in the most recent round, 2018. And we plotted these along with the actual ages. And we see that there's no convergence going on at all between the ideal ages and the observed ages. So it's not the case that there's been a convergence between ideals and reality. No, it's as reality has shifted upwards to higher ages, we also see that the ideals are shifting. So there's no convergence between the ideals and the actual ages for making the transition to parenthood. So the gap ranges depending on the country between 1.5 or 4 years. So the gap between actual age at motherhood and the ideal age of motherhood. So the actual age is always above the ideal age. And this is all before COVID hit Europe. So I think I would be very curious to know what has been happening in the recent period. So the expectation for the moment is that there's more postponing. So then the question will become to what extent there's also catching up expected later on in terms of making a transition to parenthood. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Fascinating findings there. And let's move on to our final speaker, Jolt Spader from the Hungarian Demographic Research Institute for our final presentation today on variations on the ideal age of retirement.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I hope you see my pages. Okay, now jumping to the age of retirement and old age issues. Continuous population aging, the steady increase of old age dependency ratio maintains the public awareness in the sustainability of pension schemes, and time to time drives governments to increase mandatory retirement age. As a consequence, the mean age of retirement increased in the very most of the European countries in the recent decades. On the other hand, and as my colleagues also told you, we are before the pandemic time, so pre-pandemic time, before COVID pandemic. The persistent increase of life expectancy made the people optimistic about their future, about their aging prospect perhaps. To what extent are these demographic shifts and the shifts in policies reflected in the views of the European population? Looking at the figure about men and comparing the dots and the triangles, we see that
do you think it'll be possible to maximize the screen a little bit?
We try to do that.
Thank you.
Is it better now?
Yes.
So there, as you see, the difference is simply between triangles and dots. You see that between 2006 and 2018, the average ideal retirement age clearly increased. In the most countries with 1 or 2 years, but with sharper increase in Poland and also Belgium, Hungary, you see 3-4 years increase. Secondly, the variation in the average ideal retirement age, both in 2006, 2018, as in other life events also, are significant across Europe. In 2018, it ranged from 61 years in France to 66 years in Norway. It's worth to mention that the ideal age of retirement was in 19 from the 28 surveyed European countries below 63, and in all but 4 countries below 65. This is the age range for mandatory retirement age for men in many countries and in Europe. So in the very most countries, the average ideal retirement age is clearly lower than that of the mandatory retirement age. What about women? The ideal retirement age for women varies more across countries than it does for men and increased somewhat. In 2006, values spent 8 years from Poland at age 55 to Norway at age 63. In 2018, it spans close to 9 years from Bulgaria to Iceland at age 66. Country differences in the ideal age of retirement decreased between 2006 and 2018. Ideal age, as expected for retirement for women, is lower than for men in all countries but Portugal. Gender differences are especially pronounced in Eastern Europe and close to negligible in the Nordic countries. These results indicate that Europeans often prefer to retire earlier than permitted by their country's retirement policies. At the same time, Europeans have in the last decade raised their ideal retirement age, suggesting that they are adapting to changing economic, institutional, and demographic realities. Lastly, we also wanted to be informed about attitudes being active at the labor market in older ages. This is central to policies meant to foster active aging. Europeans were asked when men and women were too old to work 20 hours a week or more. The figure shows the percentage of Europeans who in 2018 thought that men or women should not be working after 70. The vast majority of the Eastern European countries, but also in countries like France, Belgium, think that the people should stop working by 70. Whereas in Northern Europe, about half think that it is acceptable to work after 70. Most Europeans, therefore, do not see it as desirable to work far beyond retirement age, especially in countries with lower life expectancy. However, there are some countries where sizable proportion thinks that men and women could still be active in the labor market after age 70. The attitudes toward to work after retirement may be viewed as an expression of individual preferences to remain active in the later years of their life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So just to remind us to please pose questions to the speakers in the Q&A function. Just while doing that, just to let you know that after the event today, we will send you a copy, or everyone who's attended today, a copy of the top lines findings which the team have produced, which is a fascinating read. And also this seminar itself is being recorded and will also be made available. So we already have one question from Judith Coops, a general question, or perhaps to Art. Was there also a question asked about what steps a person should take to be considered an adult, like financial independence, leaving the parental home, having children, etc.? She can imagine that this differs between countries, and what we consider as typical steps in transitional to adulthood are a bit of perhaps a Western view. For example, leaving home might not necessarily be seen as part of it in some countries. In fact, taking care of your elderly parents might be seen as something you do as an adult. So perhaps Art, you could go first, and then we'll see if there's other speakers want to come in.
Yes, thank you. That's a provocative point of view. That indeed, there might be a kind of Western slide to the kind of questions being posed. Well, there wasn't in 2018. I think there was a question on what were key events in the transition to adulthood in 2006. But, well, we couldn't include all questions in 2018, so it was not possible to draw any conclusions about changes. Indeed, it would be very interesting to see what exactly people feel are markers. And that's an important kind of question. Is it that you have to move through specific transitions or specific events before you can be viewed as an adult? Or is it not necessary to really experience events, but more or less grapple of how you would want to organize your life as an individual, rather than a child in a parental home? And to me, that second point of view on independence and on adulthood is probably the one I would like better, because if you focus on the transitions as markers, you get into a very strange situation that sometimes you might feel, okay, a person hasn't made a specific transition, like into a partner relationship or having kids, and therefore can't be considered to be an adult. Well, that's certainly a kind of view that I would not want to propose as being a very scientific one. But, maybe others can add to this.
Yes, exactly. May I?
Please.
Exactly. In 2006, we analyzed the different events, and there were clear geographical variations. So the Nordic countries, leaving the parental home was the key event, but in southern countries and also in continental Europe, getting the job was the most central event defined becoming adult. Of course, the whole story is much more detailed. However, there were quite clear and significant differences, and that means, of course, that both institutional context and some cultural ideas shapes this kind of views concerning the different countries in different European regions.
Thank you. Does anyone else in the panel want to come in, or should we move to the next question? Okay, the next question probably for Jan, I think. Did you observe a correlation between the ideal age of having children and the fertility rate?
The fertility rate, you mean the total fertility rates? Because, I mean, we of course have only 2 points of measurement for the ideal ages. And if you would like to correlate it with the ups and downs in total fertility, you would of course need more. But in general, there is when there's more postponement, the period total fertility rate will go down. So in that sense, yeah, we know that there is a correlation. But so whether shifts over time are correlated, which in the ideal age are correlated with the ups and downs of total fertility, we have not observed, we have not been able to investigate that yet.
Thank you. Please post any further. Oh, another question's just come in from Daniel again to Jan. Should we interpret this rising ideal age having children as a result of cohort replacement, or is it intra-cohort change also happening?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, should we interpret this rising ideal age at having children as a result of cohort replacement, or is intra-cohort change also happening?
I think there are shifts between the cohorts in terms of ideal. So I think the younger generations are setting the ideal ages somewhat higher than younger generations. So I would call that inter-cohort change. So I don't know whether that was exactly the question, but yeah, I think it's a generational shift that's going on. So younger generations setting the ideal age at parenthood at a higher age than younger generations. Yeah.
Thank you. Gunhild, did you want to come in? I think I saw your hand. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Doesn't this have a lot to do with level of education? So that you see intra-cohort contrasts emerging because of inter-cohort. I know that's the case in Norway, where higher education has become so much more available and women are taking advantage of it, which leads to postponement. Yeah.
If I can respond to that, of course, we know that the people with higher and longer education have higher ages at ideal ages at parenthood. But what I find interesting, and I actually have a project starting right now about that using the timing of life data, is that we see a shift also among the lower educated. So it's not just that not just a compositional effect that more people now have advanced education, and for that reason we see that on average within the population we see this shift towards higher ideal ages. No, it's also among people who stop studying at age 22, let's say, who set their ideals at a higher age. So that's a shift. It's a very general shift, not limited to the people with advanced education.
But and it's not limited to certain welfare regimes.
I don't know. Well, it's limited to certain. What is the background of that question?
Well, things like parental leaves.
Yeah, I haven't investigated it, but my guess would be no. My guess would be that it's not so much related to that.
Really?
I haven't investigated yet, but I will in the next years. I'll let you know.
Great.
Thank you. Francisco, did you want to come in?
Just to chip in on the idea of between cohort and intra-cohort change. It's a very interesting idea. There's been lots of work that one could do with ESS. There's been lots of work with the General Social Survey in the US. Here, there are two challenges. First of all, if we think about the timing of life type of questions, we only have 2 time points, so it's not that easy to distinguish between cohort replacement and intra-cohort change. The second point is that because of the consistency issue between the timing of individual lives and the subjective views on the timing of life, it's not elementary to study change intra-cohort, given that people have experienced their behavior and this might have changed their ideals as well. So, but it's an important question, and it's a great challenge. I think in the report we mostly kind of look at the general picture, and then what Jan said is the view. Basically, it's probably cohort replacement, but there will be elements of intra-cohort change that need a little bit more finer methodological approaches.
I only now can read the question, and I see that there's intra-cohort change and I understood inter-cohort change. So now I fully get the question. Yeah.
And does that change your answer?
No. So what I called inter-cohort change, you can call it also cohort replacement. So, but I think it's both actually. So I think also within cohorts, you will see that for example, in the generation of my parents, let's say, that within their generation, their ideas about what is the proper age for parenthood have also shifted. But as Francesco explained, of course, with the two, and now we can start investigating that a bit because we have two measurements. So we will certainly start investigating that. But my question to that answer doesn't change now. But I think it's both, but mostly it's a cohort replacement, as it's called in the question.
I've got a question. I don't know if this is something anyone in the panel's looked at, but to what extent are some of these changes in these kind of attitudes towards life course events being driven by declines in religion in Europe? Is that something which has been looked at?
Art, maybe.
Well, we haven't been looking at changes as much as differences across Europe. And there indeed you can find that in regions where the level of religiosity is relatively low, you see that people are more likely to have approving attitudes towards non-marital relationships, or no, that's marriage is less central to their lives. So some work I did with Arike Rijken shows that people are, the less religious they are, and also the less religious the region. So there's really a contextual effect there. The more they approve of divorce, the more they approve of unmarried cohabitation, and the more that they approve of of having a child within a cohabiting union. So indeed, there is a relationship between religiosity and these kind of attitudes. And it's not just that individuals' religiosity matters, but it's also the religiosity of the context that matters, which is, I think, a very interesting finding from a sociological perspective. So if you're living in a religious environment, even though you're not religious yourself, you're still more likely to be disapproving of non-marital types of relationships.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more question, I think. A general question. What strategies would you suggest to study the effects of subjective views on timing and order of life events, given the fact that views are measured only today and in 2006, and the events may have happened a long time ago?
Maybe I can try to answer. Let's say a full approach will require longitudinal data, and we know that the ESS is a repeated cross-sectional survey. On the other hand, we have started a project, in particular with Hartley Brewer and Luca Badolato, where we try to understand a little bit by linking the two waves, the two rounds of the ESS, how to do it in a pseudo-panel approach. So it's not possible to do it with an individual level approach, but there are now techniques that allow to get at least some ideas. Of course, if you have perfect longitudinal data for one country, you can do it better, but you cannot do it comparatively. So the ESS has this unique feature to grasp comparative data, and then maybe it's worth using pseudo panel rather than panels, since you can then exploit the variation across countries and regions.
Thank you. Just in the last couple of minutes we've got, I mean, Gunhild, you mentioned in your presentation the thought of what the impact of the pandemic might be on some of these measures. Did you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, in the life course literature and some of the gender women's studies and so forth, you have notions of this interdependence being different for men and women in shaping lives. And that could go both ways in terms of what's happening to both educational careers and occupational careers. And predictability, not to leave that out. Who at the start of adulthood is the most vulnerable? And Glenn Elder's answer in Children of the Great Depression was that the Depression hit boys harder than girls because girls had a place to go in terms of primary groups and networks. Lots has happened since the Great Depression, and I am not sure. There are feminist writers who have argued that because women live more interdependently, they don't expect the kind of predictability that men do. But it seems to me that we are all, in both a philosophical and practical situation where life is not predictable anymore. And a linear mode of thinking, which has been said to be more male than female, doesn't work. Now, would that make young men more vulnerable? Just take a concept like goal-directed. It assumes predictability.
Thank you. We'll have to see. Perhaps this module might be repeated in the future. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. We're at the end of our hour, and thank everyone who's involved in the development of the module. I know it's a lot of hard work that goes into the questionnaire design as well. So many thanks to everyone who's been involved. We look forward to seeing the future publications that come out from this module. Just a reminder to everyone that all of the data is available free of charge for download to anyone for non-commercial use from the ESS website. Thank you very much again to all the speakers, and a reminder that your summary of the findings will be sent to all of the participants and will also be on the ESS website soon. Thanks very much.